Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about Ramogi Huma, who is a big-time activist in college sports around athlete activism, making sure that athletes have the proper rights and the proper ability to handle those rights that they are given. So a very big name that you will hear a lot more of as the offseason goes on, but also as the next couple of years go on, because he's a pretty remarkable individual. But let's get into some football. Let's talk about Oklahoma, and let's talk about if they are ready for the SEC. This is a big time question mark as we go into this new era of conference realignment. Are these new schools ready for what's waiting for them in their new conference? People are worried about, can Texas handle the schedule that is ahead of them in the SEC, although it's a lot nicer than Oklahoma's, which we'll get to here in a second. People are wondering if USC can handle the physicality that's coming for them in the Big Ten. So big time questions across the board. But let's start with Oklahoma, and let's talk about the Sooners and see kind of where they're rolling going into 2024. So Oklahoma feels like a bigger question between the two when you're talking about Oklahoma or Texas, right? You look at the Texas roster, it's pretty sweet. Pretty much top to bottom. There's a couple of holes here and there that you'll have to worry about. We'll likely get into Texas in their own segment, but Oklahoma feels like the bigger question mark. I think we can all agree on that, and it's because there's a couple of big-time things that are just not quite where you'd want them to be, and mainly the offensive and defensive line, and those could really hurt you, especially in the SEC. Things get a little bit more physical, and when they get more physical, the trenches become that much more important. So it'll be fascinating to see if they can, put together a really good offensive line, a really good D line, and handle that, or is that going to be the reason that they lose a couple of games? Because from where I'm standing, there's not a lot else that is wrong about this team or about this program. So when you look across pretty much the rest of their roster, leave out offensive line, leave out defensive line. I know that's a big-time caveat to throw in there, but just for a second. You have guys on the back end like Peyton Bowen you just saw. You have tons of talent. Ethan Downs as an edge rusher. You have Danny Stutzman coming back as a linebacker. There's ability across this defense. Also on offense, you have one of the best wide receiver cores in the entire country. There's no question about that. You have a running back in Gavin Sawchuk that I expect to take a big step forward. And then you have that guy right there, Jackson Arnold, who is, I expect to take a big step forward. Obviously, the O-line has a ton to do with what happens there, but the reality is I expect him to be a much better player this upcoming year. I think this team has a lot of stuff in place. The big-time issue with that is the roster can be great. The coaching can be great. The strength and conditioning can be great. The NIL can be great. All of that stuff can be in place. If they're not elite, you're going to have a tough time really competing in the SEC. And I understand that it's all splitting hairs, and there's not necessarily some things that Oklahoma can't do in that, realm of things. They absolutely have the ability to have elite across the board. But right now, they might just be a step behind everyone else. And that's not to say it's, not an easy gap to kind of close, because they can absolutely do that fairly quickly. But when you look at the SEC every single year, when you look across the teams that are dominating, every year there is a very, very good team that just gets railroaded. And it's because they're in the SEC, it's because they have a tough schedule, it's because they have some glaring holes that really get exploited in the SEC. For whatever reason, there are moments where it just looks bad for some of these teams. We saw it with some teams a year ago where it felt like they had a really, really good team, but just things didn't fall into order. This year, I kind of expect the same thing to happen with Florida, because there's a lot of really good things to like about Florida, but when you look at that schedule, it's an absolute nightmare. So they could be a 7-5 team and be a very, very good team, but that's the reality of the SEC. And the question is, for Oklahoma, are they going to be one of those teams? When you face teams like Tennessee, Texas, Ole Miss, Missouri, Bama, LSU, all in the same year, there's a little bit of worry. There's no two ways about that. And it's a little bit of a mean thing to do to the Sooners coming into the SEC, but that's the reality. When you've dominated the Big 12 for as long as Oklahoma has, you're going to walk in with a little bit of tougher schedule. And the biggest question to me isn't necessarily what this program has for the future. I think as of right this second, there are a lot of things in place for them to be a player in the SEC going forward. 2024 is a little bit more sketchy, and the problem with that is, let's just say hypothetically, Oklahoma goes 7-5. What happens to 2025 and 2026 and 7? Because as we know in the SEC, 1 year can really hurt you because recruiting margins are razor thin, transfer portal margins are razor thin. A lot of this stuff is so close, and if Oklahoma goes 7-5 while Missouri goes 9-3 and Ole Miss goes 9-3 and another team, Tennessee goes 9-3, whoever it is, if all of that happens, Oklahoma's going to have a tough time recruiting against those guys. And then they'll have a tough time getting maybe some coaches leave for those places. So the reality is the SEC is a game that is a absolute tightrope walk. And it's a little bit less so for some teams. You know, the Georgias of the world have their ducks absolutely in a row. There is no question that Georgia has elite ability on their roster, one of the best coaching staffs in the entire country. NIL is off the charts. Transfer portal, they know what they're doing. Recruiting, they're the best in the country. So Georgia, is the only one in the SEC in my mind that could not fall off a cliff in the next little bit. But the reality is the SEC is not too kind to teams that leave a little bit on the table, even in 1 year. So it could be that if a 2024, if they stumble out of the gate and look like not necessarily the Oklahoma they could look like, it doesn't necessarily stop affecting you after the 2024 season. It could affect you down the road, even 3 or 4 years down the road, depending on how the season goes. Now, all of that being said, I think there's a lot of good things in place this year. I talked about it earlier. I think that O-line is a little bit of a worry, but Bill Bedenbaugh is a fantastic coach there, and I think he's someone that can at least make this team solid at that position, which is really all you can ask for at this point. The D-line, they're still trying to pull in some guys from the transfer portal, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but I think it's one of those things where neither of those positions are going to be fantastic. I can feel very confident in saying that. I think the O-line is going to be fine. I think the interior defensive line is going to be a little shaky, but I think they'll be okay. The reality is you just cannot bottom out because when you look at this program right now, the recruiting infrastructure is great. I think Brent Venables is turning this program into something that they need to be if they're going to compete in the SEC, which is just physical, tough, angry, all of those great things that all SEC teams are, at least if they're going to be successful in the SEC, that's what you are. So I fully understand that, and I fully think that Oklahoma is going to be fine in the vein of I like the way that this program is going right now. But as I said before, and as I've said probably a couple of times at this point, 1 year in the SEC where you don't meet the expectations that you had for yourself can torpedo the next 3. So let's say O-line and D-line are as big of an issue as they look like they could be on paper. This team could affect the program. I have full faith in what this program is right now. I don't have quite as much faith in this team. And the problem is those are very much tied together. And with a conference that are razor thin margins and a million teams that you're going to have to compete against, because when you looked around the Big 12 and what Oklahoma and Texas were really up against, it was, Oklahoma State, it was Kansas State, it was some other teams from time to time that would pop into that conversation, but recruiting wise, it wasn't much of a problem. Transfer portal wise, they swung the biggest stick and they knew that. The SEC, that's not the case. Everything is razor thin margins. There's teams like Tennessee, like Missouri, like Ole Miss that are making their way up. And if Oklahoma comes out of the gate and falls on their face in 2024, they might just become a team that is not able to get up off their face until about 2027. So that's just the reality of the SEC. That's the world that you're stepping into. I think Oklahoma's going to be okay. I think they'll be able to do enough this year to where the future in the SEC will be more than fine for them, and they'll be able to kind of handle that as it comes. But there is that reality. There is that, chance that in a conference that is so tough to compete in, if you stumble out of the gate, it might be really, really hard to make up that ground in the future. So it'll be fascinating to watch this team kind of unfold. It's a very talented team at pretty much every position across the field. So I have a lot of faith in them to kind of pull it off. I have a lot of faith in Brent Venables to do what he needs to do to make it happen. But Oklahoma's in one of the weirdest positions in the entire country. It is a huge year for them, not only to, not to say that they have to, compete in the SEC or do anything crazy, but just keep your head above water. Win 8 or 9 games, show everyone that you belong, and then, work from there and continue this build that has been happening under Brent Venables, and I think will continue to happen. It's just, there's that big question mark that if the O-line and the D-line are what they look like on paper, things could get a little bit sketchy around Norman for the next couple of years. But we'll find out what will happen there as the season comes. It'll be fascinating to see if Oklahoma is ready. We won't really know until, boots are laced up and they're ready to go. But at the end of the day, I think this team is in a good spot, at least a relatively good spot right now. But that'll do it for that section of this show. We'll break down the transfer portal when we come back. A couple of big-time names have come off the board. Not a ton of intel left to give you, but definitely some big-time commitments, especially from Michigan and Ole Miss, that have some very interesting things developing in their rosters right now. So we'll break all that down right after this, so stick with us.